Thank you. Mr. Stephen Kinnock.
Speaker, last weekend's chemical weapons attack on Duma on innocent civilians was a brutal and barbaric act. 75 people, including children, have died. Over 500 with symptoms of nerve agent poisoning have been treated. This outrage clearly breached the 1925 Geneva Protocol and the 1993 Chemical Weapons Convention. Only Assad has helicopters and barrel bombs. His culpability can be in no doubt. It was at least the 9th time that Assad has used chemical weapons on his own people, and he chose to use chemical weapons in Duma specifically so as to target civilians. This was a war crime that led to unimaginable humanitarian suffering, death and destruction. Mr. Speaker, such barbarity cannot be allowed to go unchallenged. Now, there should of course be a UN investigation, but that's impossible because the Russian government continues to veto any attempts by the Security Council. And now we see the Syrian regime preventing the OPCW from entering Duma. The Syrian regime is responsible for this chemical weapons attack, and their sponsors in the Kremlin are complicit. Complicit not only because of their support for Assad and his brutal regime, but also because of their relentless work to undermine the ability of international institutions to function properly, thereby rendering the possibility of effective diplomatic action impossible. I will give way.
Very much for giving way, and I very much agree with his sentiments when it is that it was absolutely right for the Prime Minister to take this action, because it's not only Assad in Syria that's using chemical weapons, it's been propped up very much by the Russians, and we need to send a message both to Assad and the Russians that chemical weapons just are not acceptable. Yeah.
The Honourable is absolutely right. This is a universal message that needs to be sent to all of those brutal dictators who may be considering going down this route. With the Kremlin effectively dismantling the diplomatic route, we are left with no option but to apply military force. It pains me to say this, but the sad reality is that the future of Syria is in the hands of the Kremlin, Iran and the Assad regime. However, that does not mean that we have no agency. It does not mean that we should allow the international norms around the prohibition of chemical weapons to wither on the vine. And that is why it was right to act in the name of humanitarian concerns and to assert the prohibition of the use of chemical weapons. But, Mr. Speaker, Parliament should have had a say. For over a decade, that's been the way that we have operated in this place. And the dispute about parliamentary authorisation reveals the shortcomings of a convention-based constitutional system. The Leader of the Opposition is therefore right that we should have a War Powers Act. Of course, the devil will be in the detail. It must not be so loose as to allow the government to do anything, but it must also not be so tight as to bind the hands of government and those on the front line to the extent that the Act would effectively become an impossibly high bar to pass. Mr. Speaker, what's clear is that the costs to non-intervention are clear. Non-intervention would equate to a tacit approval of the abhorrent use of chemical weapons. A targeted strike on the installations that enable the use of chemical weapons not only degrades the Syrian capacity to deliver and use chemical weapons again, but it also sends a signal that their use will not be tolerated. We must therefore be steadfast and we must be consistent. And we must also do more to support those who have fled Syria, escaping this barbarity, stepping up to fulfil our obligations to address the refugee crisis. Mr. Speaker, my party has a proud history of standing up for the most vulnerable. We led the world to intervene in Kosovo, to preventing genocide, and we understood that the Russian veto precluded the UN route at that time. The Labour Party is not a pacifist party. Indeed, it was a Labour Foreign Secretary, Ernest Bevin, who was the driving force behind establishing NATO, and I am truly proud of the Labour Party's role 60 years ago, almost to the day, in the signature of the Treaty of Brussels. We are a party that understands that all it takes for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing, and women indeed. We understand the costs of non-intervention, just as we appreciate and learn from the costs of intervention. Where would we be if pacifists had been in charge in 1939? If the only intervention that we contemplate is that with a UN Security Council approval, then we would be allowing the Kremlin to dictate our foreign policy. I refuse to allow my country or my party to be held hostage by Vladimir Putin. And so I will always uphold the fine history of my party, which is to be ready, willing and able to intervene and to shoulder our responsibility to protect.
John Barrow.